Hello and welcome everyone to the Asia Society Policy Institute's webinar on US-India 2025 Strains, Shifts and the Road Ahead. I'm Farwa Aamer, Director of South Asia Initiatives here at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. At the start of the year, the trajectory of US-India relations appeared promising. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's early meeting with President Trump in February in Washington and the many ambitious goals that came out of the meeting signaled an intention on both sides to sustain the relationship's upward momentum. India entered 2025 buoyed by a bipartisan consensus in Washington that New Delhi remains central to the Indo-Pacific balance. But as we approach at the end of the year, that early optimism has given way to a sense of drift. Today, bilateral ties are feeling the strain, whether from the stop-start nature of the pending trade deal, tensions surrounding India's oil imports from Russia amid the protracted war in Ukraine, or Washington's renewed engagement with Islamabad. And yet, despite these pressures, many fundamentals of the partnership, particularly in defense cooperation, remain robust. As both countries now look toward a new year with a lingering trust deficit, we are confronted with some critical questions. What will it take to reset the relationship? How will New Delhi navigate an evolving geopolitical landscape that is testing the limits of its multi-aligned foreign policy? And what does this all mean for US-India bilateral trade and the future of groupings like the Quad? To unpack all this and more, I'm delighted to be joined by a brilliant panel of experts today. We have with us Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director, Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, Akshay Mathur, Senior Director, Asia Society Policy Institute in New Delhi, and Jane Mellsop, Director of Trade, Investment, and Economic Security at the Asia Society Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining me. But before we begin, just a few housekeeping notes. I'll start with some questions for our panel on my end, and at about 45-minute mark, we'll take questions from the audience via the Zoom Q&A box. So please send in your queries, and we'll try to get to some of them by the end of our session. So without further ado, Lisa, if we could just start with you. You've been tracking this relationship from Washington for many years. Some of the developments that contributed to the trust deficit this year caught many observers off guard. From your perspective, were these sources of friction foreseeable? And how are US policymakers now rethinking not just their India strategy, but also the broader South Asia approach, especially as the region becomes more fluid and the US domestic policy environment more inward looking? So over to you, Lisa.
Well, thank you. And thank you to ASPI for inviting me here today. It's great to be here. Look, I don't think that this severe deterioration in ties between the US and India that we've seen over the last 5 or so months was foreseeable. Because if you look at the track record of the first Trump administration on India, it was very positive. US-India relations went very well under the first Trump administration. You had a successful visit by President Trump to India in February 2020, where many agreements were inked. You had US supporting India during its time of crisis, during the India-China border crisis in 2020. So really, the relationship was elevated during Trump's first term. And even at the beginning of the Trump 2 administration, we saw very positive signs. Prime Minister Modi made an early, successful visit to the White House. The two signed a joint statement, indicating that cooperation was going to continue across the board. What changed? Well, that was the India-Pakistan conflict, which occurred in May, and the aftermath. And of course, there was a distinct difference in how President Trump characterized the ending of that conflict and India's version of events. So that caused a lot of tension. And I think President Trump really craved Indian recognition for his role in getting the ceasefire, which India simply was not going to provide. I mean, this is a really sensitive issue for India and for Prime Minister Modi, this idea that there was U.S. mediation between the two countries. India has never allowed for any third-party mediation in its disputes with Pakistan. So this was simply a no-go area for Prime Minister Modi. And unfortunately, that has not been accepted by President Trump. And in June, Prime Minister Modi and President Trump had a very tense and strained phone call where, again, they basically disagreed on the U.S. role in the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. So I think really that is the fundamental issue here and why we have seen relations deteriorate so badly over the last few months. Now, it may not be the only reason. I think also, President Trump is frustrated with Indian protectionist trade policies, and he is expecting a good trade deal with India. And that's why it's taken so long to negotiate this trade deal. So I think the combination of those two things, the frustration over the aftermath of the India-Pakistan conflict and the inability of the two sides to come to a trade deal, is really what's causing this friction and tension. Now, how are U.S. policymakers approaching India now, given this context? Well, I think they're trying hard to get the relationship back on track. What I've heard is that Secretary of State Rubio, USTR Jamieson Greer have tried to put trade deals forward to President Trump. He has refused them. They haven't been good enough for him. But they continue to work on trying to find that trade deal. And of course, that would help. That would help the tone of the relationship immensely if they could conclude a trade deal and both sides could claim to be winners with that deal. But the other point is the national security strategy that was just released a few days ago does highlight India. It talks about India's important role in the Indo-Pacific. It talks about the Quad and how that's important. It talks about India helping in terms of countering Chinese gray zone activity in the South China Sea, helping with supply chains. So it does seem that there is still recognition of India's important role and the importance of the U.S.-India strategic partnership for United States goals in the Indo-Pacific. So I think that is still there, but we just somehow have to overcome this anger of President Trump about the ending of the India-Pakistan conflict.
Thank you, Lisa. So, as you flagged, a key divergence emerged from the difference in narratives post the May conflict between India and Pakistan, and of course, the frustration over a trade deal that's just not good enough for the president. So, on that note, if I could come to you, Akshay, so much of what we have seen and also what Lisa mentioned has been driven by geoeconomics as well. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on where does the United States fit in India's geoeconomic landscape today? And has there been a change in the outlook from where we were initially in the year to where we are now? So over to you, Akshay.
Actually, as the world's largest economy at $30 trillion, the foreign economic policy of the United States actually has an asymmetric influence on the global economy, and that includes India. It's worth actually reviewing where United States fits in to India's geoeconomic landscape. The magnitude of the geoeconomic importance that the United States has often tends to get lost a little bit in some of the discussions we have. I look at it really maybe in three categories, and there's some statistics which I think are worth highlighting. The parts of the economic partnership which are often repeated are to do with trade. Recognizing the United States as India's largest trading partner, one with whom we have a goods surplus and a near balanced trade in services. This is as of last year, so we'll see how this year fares out. But also as India's largest foreign direct investor at $70 billion since we started to keep a record. And also has the largest share of companies that have global capability centers in India. Nearly 40% of global capability centers in India trace their roots to US firms. So I think this has come to define a lot of the conversation. What is really less discussed is the large share that United States has in India's capital markets. It's the largest foreign investor. 40% of total assets under management are held by American companies. That's close to $350 billion. So that's a large number. And also that the United States has become one of the most promising destinations for India's overseas direct investments. And this record is now increasingly showing, the central bank keeps this record, that there's increasingly an outward investment that's taking place, which is encouraged from both sides. And there's a portion of our economic partnership which really isn't in the mainstream discourse at all. So, for instance, the US remains a large source of venture capital funding for our startups, and that it's also the largest source of remittances for India. And, it's 30% of India's total remittances. That's nearly $30 billion. And $30 billion, by the way, is 5 to 6 times of the total FDI that comes from the US every year. So these are large numbers. And we, of course, don't talk as often about the foreign exchange reserves that we hold in US dollars, nearly $220 billion worth of foreign exchange reserves. So I think if you look at India's geoeconomic landscape, it's multifaceted, and the imprint of the United States in different aspects of our economy is quite visible. And if you notice, I only use the word largest. I'm not even talking of areas where it's number 2 or number 3. So I think that just goes to show the importance that the United States has held. The one area where we're likely to see a big difference going forward is, of course, trade, because the tariffs will come to hit the numbers, particularly in sectors in agriculture and textiles and so on, specific segments in which the tariffs have been imposed. And I also want to make one point here, that I think that the numbers in the investments in capital markets, both portfolio investments and direct investments, are also probably going to reflect a slowdown, because while the tariffs are not directed towards portfolio investments or direct investments, there is a correlation, and one can argue a causation for those who track markets, which is going to be, those numbers are we're already seeing a slowdown, and I think the final result will only be clear when the financial year ends.
Well, thank you, Akshay. That really helps paint a broader picture of where the United States sits in India's sort of economic landscape, and the importance of it as an economic partner, and what happens next is going to be crucial for both economies. But as Lisa also pointed out, that there is strength within Washington still, there's support within Washington still for improving India-United States ties, and a large portion of it is around what happens next within the trade deal. So, Jane, you've been tracking these U.S. trade negotiations very closely, and as we speak, there's a trade team in Delhi likely wrapping up its recent round of talks and visit, which have shown some optimism. But these trade negotiations have been going on for a while, like Lisa mentioned. It's just not been good enough. We almost had a breakthrough in this summer. But despite all of this back and forth, we still don't have a deal. There's some musings of a possible March deal now. But I want to hear from you. Firstly, if you could just walk us through what have been the sticking points preventing progress, and just looking ahead, do you see a viable pathway towards concluding an agreement, even surprisingly by the year end, or say March, the new deadline that we are hearing? Over to you, Jane.
Thanks very much, and yeah, great to be here joining everyone today for this important discussion. So, yeah, I guess I think, as Lisa mentioned, the year started off really well, actually, and we saw the announcement of the launch of the bilateral trade agreement negotiations in February, and there was a lot of optimism, at that time, and talk of concluding a deal by fall of this year. Obviously, over the course of the year, a whole lot of different things happened, including, in particular, the application by the US of a range of tariffs on India. So in August, we saw the reciprocal tariff of 25% actually come into effect. Shortly following that, we saw the application of another 25% come into effect for India, which was tied to their imports of oil from Russia. Now, I think that's probably one of the first things that I wanted to highlight was really, with President Trump having taken that action, it would be pretty difficult to conclude a trade deal while those issues around Russian oil still existed. So I think that was probably one of the key points in the last few months, is that they were really looking for India to make some changes in terms of its imports of oil from Russia. And we have seen that, and we've seen some positive comments in November from President Trump himself saying that this issue has largely been resolved, and even as recently as last week from USTR Greer. So I think that the Russian oil was definitely a sticking point and something that was really holding up the trade talks, over recent months. But hopefully we're seeing some progress there. But I think one of the issues that's really been in play the whole of the year and is still in play and becoming difficult is what we're calling agricultural market access. So I think Lisa mentioned as well that it's really difficult to try and reach agreement on this issue. The US, has pointed out that the average applied tariff in agriculture is 39%. It's very high, and they're wanting to see that come down. On the other hand, we've got India talking about the real domestic sensitivities that they have in the agricultural sector. We know that about 45% of India's population actually rely on agriculture for some form of income. That farmer voting bloc is very important in India. It's going to be very difficult to open up that market. Those farmers are really concerned about the competition from imports from the US, and from other countries for that matter. So I think agricultural market access really remains a key sticking point. And we've seen Indian ministers talk about the importance of protecting small businesses and the importance of protecting their farmers. So I think that continues to be something that's really difficult for the negotiators to get over the line. And related to that, I guess, is what are often called non-tariff barriers. So those are the barriers, not just tariffs, but behind the border barriers. So India is quite well known for a number of its barriers that it's put in place, a whole lot of certification requirements, licensing requirements, sort of paperwork, red tape that exists that makes it quite difficult for exporters to really access the market. So the US is really keen to make some progress there, and I think it's also difficult for India to strip back some of those as well, and certainly to do that in any kind of speedy fashion as well. One of the things that is also worth, I think, thinking about a little bit is that what we've seen from some recent agreements that the US has concluded with other countries is a focus on what's called the WTO e-commerce moratorium. So this is where basically WTO members have agreed that duties, will not be applied to e-commerce. So that sort of cloud services, streaming, that sort of thing, digital products. And this is rolled over every couple of years. But the US is looking for that to be made permanent. And in some of their recent deals, they have, secured other partners to agree to that. But we know that India is not keen on that. And in the past, they've been really resistant to that. They want to try and preserve the opportunity for them to perhaps, levy those sort of duties in the future. So I think that could also be a sticking point. I guess one of the other key questions that's really probably coming up is how much is the US actually going to reduce those tariffs, and what number is can they come to? So we've seen recently, of course, Japan have reduced that down to 15%. Other partners in Southeast Asia are more around 20 or 19%. So I think that there'll be a lot of discussion and around exactly the number that the US is going to give, and is India going to be happy with that number? Another issue that's come up a lot for other agreements is it's not just these reciprocal tariffs that are in place. The US is also imposing a number of tariffs under what's called Section 232, And those tariffs are perhaps, a bit more permanent, if you like, or a bit more stable in terms of the ability of the US to impose those. Some of the future ones that are potentially coming down the line, and pharmaceuticals and semiconductors, will be of particular interest to India. Pharmaceuticals being one of the largest exports of India to the US, so they'll be severely impacted by anything there. So they'll no doubt be wanting to try and get the US to agree some sort of special provision for India in regard to that. So that's no doubt a bit of a sticking point. In terms of a pathway to concluding an agreement, I think it's really positive that talks are still continuing. And as you mentioned, happening there today. There was a bit of a hiatus in the summer following, those difficulties that have already been mentioned. And I think the question is really, how long can India hold out on its red lines? We have seen some trade statistics coming out. There was some research from an India think tank that showed that exports had fallen between May and October by more than 25%, exports to the US. So there's definitely, issues there for India, and we're going to be seeing that more and more over coming months. India also will be really mindful of remaining competitive, with its other neighbors. So, for example, in textiles, Vietnam, it's got 20% tariff. If India's up at 50%, that's going to be really challenging for it to maintain its market share as well. So I think what I'd be looking for is some more sort of high-level engagement in terms of the pathway. So it'd be really great if we could see some sort of leader-level engagement. I think that's often in sort of what we sometimes call an action forcing kind of moment, and will really give impetus to officials to really try and reach an agreement so that leaders are able to, have something to announce when they meet.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. As you flagged, India has followed a very protectionist policy and it's been keeping its domestic sensitivities in mind when it comes through all of these trade negotiations. But as you also flagged, there is optimism, but it will probably need some political weight, and that might just come from a leadership level engagement, which we've seen lacking in the past few months, and that might just drive a deal. But what we're waiting on, as you mentioned, is how much is the US willing to reduce these tariffs? What that rollback will look like. So that interim framework deal, what would that look like for India, including what will happen to the punitive tariffs of that additional 25% that India was hit with in August for its imports of Russian oil. So, but speaking of Russia, Akshay, if I could come to you once again. That's been a persistent friction point for India, that India's relationship with Russia for Washington. Washington's argued that India's discounted oil purchases indirectly funded Moscow's war effort. And then we saw the 25% tariff hit in August, and then these new sanctions on Russian energy entities, which have kind of complicated further India's import structure. So while there has been some movement there, India has begun scaling back on energy imports. President Putin was recently in New Delhi, which sort of signaled that India will not distance itself from Moscow simply due to US pressure. How should we be interpreting the strategic messaging behind this summit and its outcomes? And looking ahead, do you anticipate that Russia will become an even sharper point of contention in US-India ties, or is there a scenario perhaps tied to movement on Ukraine peace negotiations where Washington and New Delhi can once again compartmentalize their differences? So over to you, Akshay.
If I were to brand President Putin's visit and this summit, I would have branded it as an economic summit. The launch of the program on economic cooperation to $100 billion between India and Russia by 2030, and the focus on trade imbalance and interoperability between financial systems all lead me to indicate that the two countries had decided that they wanted to make business and economics and finance as the primary focus, at least in the public domain. But there were three telling statements, and I think maybe it's more interesting to interpret the summit through these three statements. One that came from Prime Minister Modi, where he said he really made a clarion call to develop a simplified, predictable mechanism for conducting business. So presumably this is for mitigating the sanctions that are, hurting the sanctions imposed by the United States, US, US, EU, and UK. So you know that India has cut Russian oil by about 40%, and as the sanctions have become stricter, and the direct sanctioning of one of the Indian oil companies has been hurting. By the way, the CEO of Rosneft was on the delegation that came from Russia. So so that's one statement. The second statement came from President Putin, where he's underlying that 96% of trade is already settled through national currencies. Again, I think I see that as a sign of, and this was followed by a statement of intent to do more business in national currencies, interoperability of financial systems, financial messaging systems, even central bank digital currency platforms, insurance, reinsurance, and so on. Again, the governor of Russian central bank was part of the delegation. So I saw that as a signal of at least wanting to develop some kind of an alternate mechanism for making payments to what India owes Russia. And also, finally, President Putin's second statement, where he talks about providing uninterrupted fuel supplies to the Indian economy. So this is not just crude oil. Obviously, that is an important part of it, but it's also civil nuclear energy, where Russia has 2 out of the 6 nuclear reactors which are already active now. So I think overall, I see that the Russia still understands India's security needs. All that India has done so far, whatever it has bought so far from Russia has been under the Russian oil cap system that has been imposed. So it's legal as far as my knowledge goes. And finally, I do think that you're looking into the future. I do think that India would not want to antagonize the United States beyond a point. So it has like I said in my first intervention, if you look at India's geoeconomic landscape, United States plays a pivotal role. So I see India trying to develop a working mechanism, send a signal that Russia is a strong and fair weather. I mean, it's an all-time friend, but also with the hope that not to derail any trade negotiations or strategic conversations that India is having with the United States.
And thank you, Akshay. I agree. There's momentum there, but there's also great value in maintaining the relationship with the United States for all the reasons that you've pointed out. Lisa mentioned, Jane mentioned. There's also an important factor here, which is despite all the sharp rhetoric that has come out of Washington, you've not really seen New Delhi retaliate, which has been a good way of progressing on this relationship, and probably what's keeping the ties still somewhat, despite being uncertain, somewhat optimistic that there could possibly be a reset into the new year. But speaking of what's keeping the ties stable somewhat is, of course, the defense partnership, Lisa, which has remained resilient. We have a new 10-year US-India defense pact, which is signaling sort of long-term strategic commitment by the two countries. Do you see defense cooperation sort of now becoming the principal stabilizer of this relationship as we go into the new year, perhaps even overshadowing some of the other major areas of cooperation, I mean, even including trade and technology? And on the regional architecture side, I do want to bring this up because we've been in several rooms talking about the Quad. So while the Quad foreign ministers did meet twice, there's not been a leaders' summit this year, which has raised questions about its sustainability. But you did mention the national security strategy earlier, which mentions India, but it also gives a shout out to the Quad. So how confident are you about, say, a Quad leaders summit next year? Or do you think we're moving toward a more distributed model where India, Japan, and Australia carry sort of greater operational weight of this grouping as Washington sort of balances other multiple global priorities? So over to you, Lisa.
Great, thank you. On the question about defense carrying the relationship, and whether it might even be more important or become more important than the technology relationship. I would say both defense and technology cooperation continues and are likely to both carry the relationship. We just saw a major defense deal concluded between the U.S. and India for $946 million. It's a deal for the sustainment of U.S.-made helicopters in India. That's very significant. But we've also seen the tech cooperation continue. We've seen Google, Microsoft, Amazon all make major multi-billion investment announcements in the last several weeks to develop India's AI infrastructure, including data centers. So what I heard, I was in New Delhi the first week of November, and what I heard is that the cooperation on technology, particularly AI, where the U.S. and India stand to both benefit by mutual cooperation in this field, that it continues. So that is somewhat heartening. And I think that the private sector interest in developing India's AI sector will also help carry the U.S.-India relationship. When it comes to the Quad, I think, as you mentioned, the National Security Strategy does mention the Quad as important, which is good. We also know that Secretary of State Rubio has held 2 Quad meetings. The one in July was particularly productive. They put out a comprehensive joint statement talking about continuing the cooperation in technology, supply chains, in critical minerals, in maritime security. And in fact, the 4 nations held the at-sea observer mission of their coast guards cooperating in July. So, that continues. Not to mention the Malabar naval exercise involving the 4 countries, which happened recently. So I think we are seeing a lot of important cooperation continue. And I think, that's one of the points I would make in terms of the United States' interest. If the United States, sort of de-emphasizes its relationship with India or continues to lose trust from India, that's going to have a negative impact on the Quad. And the Quad is an important, tool in the U.S. toolkit to assert a free and open Indo-Pacific, to push back against China's, maritime gray zone activities, and to, basically cooperate with these 4 important nations, among these 4 important nations, to compete more effectively with China when it comes to alternative supply chains, technology, critical minerals, you name it. So I think it's very important that there is a Quad Leaders Summit early next year. This is the first year, 2025, when we haven't had a Quad Leaders Summit in the last 4 years. And it's noticeable. It does seem that, it gives the impression that Quad is losing momentum. There's not the support for it. So I think it is important to have that leader level summit early next year. And so hopefully we'll see that happen. I just want to make one last point on the Russia issue. So I just talked about, the continuing defense cooperation between the U.S. and India. There's, other important cooperation happening. The GE jet engine technology cooperation that we are seeing, although I think from the Indian perspective, it's not happening fast enough or quickly enough, but it is moving forward. But the more that India engages in advanced technology cooperation with Russia, the more that it depends on high-end defense items from Russia, that will impact the U.S. ability to extend its most advanced cooperation with India. So I think, eventually India will have to make a choice on, does it want to, does it see its future, its technology, advanced defense technology future with the United States or with Russia? because I think it's going to be harder and harder for it to try to balance between the two nations.
Thank you so much, Lisa. No, completely agreed. For the importance of a leaders summit is what is going to add a lot more optimism into how we see Quad going forward. But again, there are other dimensions here. What happens to the U.S. China policy? A softer policy towards China would reduce sort of the strategic calculus of Indo-Pacific partners, but at the same time, there is always that possibility of a sharper China policy, and that is where you need sort of these partners to work in tandem. And like you mentioned, the foreign ministers meeting in July produced a number of very clean-cut outcomes, one of them being Quad Critical Minerals Initiative, which is going to be an important sort of partnership to diversify the supply chain away from risky geographies, which in this case is China, with so much of the refining and mining that takes place in the country. But also, another thing that you pointed out right now, which the military dependency that India has toward Russia. So, how is that nature of the relationship also going to change when it comes to maintaining or resetting India's relationship with the United States? It's going to be an important factor in addition to what happens in trade. So that goes back to what we were discussing earlier, that this year has been kind of testing for how much flexibility there is for India to exercise its strategic autonomy and its multi-aligned foreign policy. So we'll see going into the next year and the coming years if there is a choice that needs to be made in India's own interest. But I do want to remind everyone that in about 15 minutes from now, we will take audience Q&A, so audience questions. So please use the Zoom Q&A function to send in your questions, and we'll try to get to some of them. Akshay and Jane, just coming back to you once again, while we wait on a US-India trade deal, India is moving swiftly on other fronts. It's finalized a landmark FTA with the United Kingdom. There are fresh talks and fast-moving talks with the EU. They've opened discussions with Canada on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, and they're exploring expanded critical mineral partnerships with other countries. How do you interpret this diversification? Is it primarily a hedge against uncertainty in the US track, or part of a broader strategy by New Delhi as it works toward the 2047 Viksit Bharat vision and embed itself more deeply in multiple economic systems simultaneously? And how might this multi-directional trade approach shape India's negotiating leverage with Washington going forward? So if I could hear from you, Akshay, first, and then Jane.
Maybe it's best for me to make some top-level observations, and then Jane can take the easy question about how to leverage that for negotiations with Washington. I think FTA now is really, it's interesting how the conversations around FTAs have evolved. FTA, free trade agreement conversations now are really first and foremost a signal of economic stability, of economic ties, rather than just concessions alone. And I think that's a major shift that's taking place over the last, I would say, post-COVID, but particularly in the last year. Two, I think that the nature and scope of FTAs was changing anyway, because we had many more issues than just tariff line concessions. So, for instance, investment facilitation, intellectual property rights, and so on. But there is more, for India particularly, there is now a direct correlation with the foreign investments, both direct investments and portfolio investments that come into our capital markets, as I mentioned earlier on in the program. And the FTA is also important for Indian enterprises as they start to go global. So it's not just at the receiving end. Many Indian enterprises are also now venturing abroad, and they are quite keen to include the clauses and commitments which protect industry and IPR. So it's not just one way. The United States and the the trade conversation with the United States may have instigated or catalyzed India to look in different direction. But even if for the sake of argument, the trade and economic partnership with the United States had remained the same without any disruption, India would still have to go out there and negotiate FTAs. And the reason is that the world around us is changing. If Vietnam today has a FTA with the European Union, then India would also have to look at FTAs just to stay in the game and remain competitive against our own, against all the other competing economies. I think that India has cheap labor, but then there are other countries that have where the cost of production is cheaper, and we certainly don't want to lose out just because our corporations didn't have the gumption or didn't have the access to foreign markets. And finally, just with one more thought, I think increasingly you will see India reach out to high-cost markets. And so European Union is a good example there. And there are some others also that you have mentioned where it seems unlikely for the manufacturing to move back. While the United States has publicly made comments, obviously, particularly the Trump administration of wooing manufacturing back to the United States. But is manufacturing really going to move back to Germany, European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand? So hopefully there is a symbiotic economic partnership that can be built with the countries for which cost of production is still high.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with everything that Akshay said. I just add a couple of comments there, and he sort of emphasized this, that India, it seems to be moving more towards free trade agreements with developed economies. And I think that is something that is really interesting and worth watching. As Akshay mentioned, they're interested in that investment. They're really interested in getting into sort of high quality supply chains. And they are interested in being able to export their goods to, middle class, upper class consumers as well. So I think that's something that we have seen that did start before this year. So I think that is important to note, is that this was going on before, and as part of India's more, strategic outlook that it needed to do that. But at the same time, what we're seeing is that this year it's been accelerated. And that's not just from India, that's from a lot of countries around the world. So, India has been talking to the EU about intensifying, their negotiations. And we saw the EU Trade Commissioner, visiting India as well recently. But the EU is feeling the same. So I think that's important, is that we've got the impetus for both sides now to actually, move forward with these negotiations. They want to look for deals, they want to conclude deals as well. In terms of that question of what it means for the negotiations with the US, I think President Trump is not going to respond well to some sort of claim from India that, we have a lot of other partners now, and so, we have other opportunities. I don't think that's going to go down so well, with the US. But I think the fact that India is doing a lot of deals with other countries does send an important signal nevertheless, so I think that is important. And it's certainly something that will be noted and, will be noticed by the US, that India is out there doing other deals. One of the more sort of practical sides of this is that what it means is, for example, the UK deal has been concluded, it's been released. It means that countries can look at that text and see what India has been willing to do and what India, has been willing to give up, for example, on market access. So it means that the US can point to that and can actually see, where India is moving and make a claim for getting the same or even better treatment, in its deal. And that can work both ways as well. I think it will be, no doubt, incumbent on India to point to the deals it is doing and show the areas where it hasn't moved as well. And it can show consistency in its policy there as well. I think the other thing with doing these deals is it does give India a bit more credibility in this space. I think, we do know that in the past, India has been quite difficult to deal with at the WTO. We know that, for example, in Trump 1, they got quite close to concluding a deal with the US, but weren't able to get that over the line. So I think the fact that India is now doing more deals is also giving it more credibility in the sort of FTA space. I mean, some of those deals have been a bit more limited than others, but the UK deal, was comprehensive, and I think that's a good one for them to point to. So, yeah, I think that no doubt they will be trying to use that, in these negotiations with the US, and hopefully, we can see a deal with the US coming through quite soon.
Thank you, Jane. Certainly diversifying its economic portfolio, its basket of economic partnerships is helpful for India's own ambition and goals, but also, as you mentioned, it does send some sort of a signal. And in terms of what's being read in Washington and looking at India's diversified partnerships, there is another factor here, which is BRICS. Lisa, India will assume BRICS presidency next year, and at a moment when the grouping is also expanding, and President Trump has been openly skeptical about that platform. Prime Minister Modi's partnership in the recent SEO summit, which was his first visit to China in 7 years, also drew considerable attention in Washington. So if strains in US-India relationship persist going into 2026, how do you assess the likelihood that India leans more heavily on platforms such as the BRICS or the SCO, or even a revived RIC format to diversify its strategic options? And would such an engagement represent a fundamental shift in India's geopolitical alignment, or merely a tactical balancing act as New Delhi navigates uncertainty in its ties with Washington? So very quickly, Lisa, before we go into our audience questions.
Yeah, I think that India will remain engaged, of course, with the BRICS and SCO as a way to, balance its relationships between Russia and China and the United States. But let's be clear, China is a strategic adversary of India. They, had a major border crisis where Indian soldiers' lives were lost in 2020. They fought a war in 1962. They still have active, serious border disputes. So I think, if India gives more power to groups like the BRICS or the SCO, it risks China getting more power and becoming more the regional hegemon. So I think India has to be very careful. And, it's interesting because when I think the US-India relationship was very strong during the Biden administration, India would make the argument to the Biden administration officials that it attending the BRICS was helpful because it could actually play a role in stopping some of the, worst of the actions, such as de-dollarization. So we're in a different ballgame now that we see less trust and more friction between the United States and India. There is less trust that India's involvement in the BRICS would somehow be a positive thing, or they would be playing a role where they're stopping anti-US action in these forums. So yes, India will continue to be engaged with these organizations, but I think they realize that they don't want these organizations to be too powerful, because that then translate to China having more power globally.
Thank you, Lisa. But China is certainly an important neighbor for India for many reasons, but also this relationship that India has with China, which seems some sort of cautious engagement now. Actually, there is a question, if I could just nudge you on that. Any signs of changes in Indo-China relations? Would it have any possible ramifications for India-US relations?
Well, look, again, I would emphasize that China is a strategic adversary of India. And yes, India did visit with President Xi, first time in a long time. They want to cool down the tensions along the line of actual control. Yes, but India did not attend the Chinese military parade that happened the next day. And, there will be limits on what India and China can do. India will still be skeptical about strategic investments by China in India, for instance, in the telecom sector. And the tensions remain along their disputed border. So I think that, the U.S. doesn't need to sort of be concerned that India is going to run into China's arms. That's not going to happen. But at the same time, the U.S. should not assume that because India and China have this adversarial relationship, that India relies on the United States to defend it against China, and therefore the U.S. can push India around or, be tough on India. That is not the case. That's a misunderstanding. Again, India plays this balancing role. It's had to manage its relationship with China in the past. It can do so without the United States, I would argue. So I think the two benefit. The United States and India benefit by having a strong relationship. The United States benefits if India has the capabilities to stand up to China and hold its own with China. So it doesn't behoove the U.S. to, start being very tough on India and trying to push India around, because that could force India to, yes, become more accommodationist to China, which is not in the United States' interest, because that would not be helpful. But it's not a simple equation here when it comes to U.S., India, China. There's more of a dance that I think we see between the three nations. But I think it would be overstating the case to say that if the U.S. can't rely, or if the India cannot rely on the U.S., it's somehow going to run into China's arms. No, that's not going to happen.
Thank you, Lisa. Akshay, I'd be curious. Do you agree with Lisa? Do you have any additional perspectives on this?
I'm not going to disagree with Lisa. Hypothetically, if China were to somehow orchestrate a situation in which the $100 billion worth of trade deficit somehow is to magically reduce in the next 5 years, I do think that changes the bilateral between India and China. There's a strategic underpinning to the relationship, which goes back in history. But China is a double-barreled gun for us right now because we have issues strategically, but also an economic partnership which is unsustainable. And so, if there is a way in which the if the pain of the trade deficit were to mellow, then I think there is a different conversation that will start taking place between India and China, and which will infuse BRICS and so on. So yes, I do agree that China does not substitute the United States for us, but a different relationship with China potentially is possible if China decides to take a more of an asymmetric approach to conceding more on trade for us.
Thank you, Akshay. There is another question, and if I could just go around this virtual room and get all of your thoughts very quickly on that. What can India do to improve its relationship with the United States? So trade seems like an obvious one. So Jane, I'll start with you, then Lisa, and then Akshay.
Thanks very much. I think in terms of improving its relationship with the US is really looking to reduce the deficit. I think that's something that President Trump has made pretty clear with a lot of partners, and India is a big one there. I mean, the deficit last year was about 45 billion, so there's a lot of room to move there, and I think one of the best ways of doing that is to open up the market, to the US. So I think in terms of improving the relationship there, India needs to really take a good look at its own domestic protection measures and see what can be done to open that up to the US. And I think sending those sort of signals and making some good moves there, I think will be really important to unlocking the trade deal, but also more broadly in terms of making that into a more positive relationship on the trade front. So that's something that I would probably highlight there.
Thank you, Jane. Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, I have to agree with Jane. I think that, India can move on the trade issues. India could halt its Russian oil imports. Look, India imported less than 1% of its energy needs from Russia before Russia invaded Ukraine. It's simply been taking advantage of discounted prices over the last 3.5 years. So if India wanted to, it could definitely reverse that situation. It could import more energy from the United States, from the Middle East. There's plenty of other suppliers. So it could do that, which would go a long way. I think if India, halted altogether its Russian oil imports, then we would see the 25% tariff disappear. Also, it could open up its soybean markets for U.S. farmers. This is very important for U.S. farmers to have markets for its soybean exports. And I think this is something that perhaps India can do now that the Bihar elections are over. Perhaps Prime Minister Modi has a little bit more political space in terms of the farmers and their, important domestic influence. And, announcing more investment in the United States. This is something that, worked for South Korea and Japan when they made major investment announcements. This helped, I think, tip the trade deal, over the finish line. And, continuing to import U.S. energy, defense imports to reduce that trade deficit with the United States. I think these are all things that are eminently doable for India.
Thank you, Lisa. And it kind of also answers one of the questions that we have here between you and Jane, what you talked about trade, is just why don't we have a trade deal and what is blocking the breakthrough? I think these are some of the movements that we will have to see from India's end for the United States to sort of come around first with the resolution of the tariffs that we also discussed earlier in our discussion, and then eventually this more ambitious bilateral deal that'll take them to the Mission 500 goal that was decided during Prime Minister Modi and President Trump's meeting earlier on in February. Akshay, to you.
I used to think that providing a really good series of investment opportunities is probably going to do the trick, because it's worked, as Lisa has said, for South Korea and Japan, as well as for the European Union. They've all given, billions of dollars of commitments. But now that I'm studying those deals a little bit more, I'm finding that I'm not exactly sure if India has the capacity or the appropriate instruments to be able to offer those kinds of investments. So, for instance, in the deal with the United States has with Japan, 90% of the profits are going to be retained in the United States of all the investments that are made by the Japanese firms. So I'm not sure if that's going to really work for India. I think increasingly I'm looking towards the technology space. Again, it was mentioned earlier that Amazon and Microsoft and Google, all three of them have actually made announcements this week. Google at $15 billion, Microsoft at $17.5 billion, and Amazon at $35 billion. And if that's the kind of partnership, I see that as a signal of an economic partnership which is more futuristic, and there's something there where it brings together talent, it brings together investments, it brings together a certain confidence in high technology and being able to work on high technology items without it being preceded by an agreement, like an investment facilitation agreement or an IPR agreement. So it means that there is some room there. And so I'd pin my hopes on technology. I mean, the executives from Starlink were in a meeting with Government of India officials yesterday. So I think that put my money on India's capital markets, which is, fourth largest IPO market in the world today, after the United States and China. I'd put my money on India's consumer market, which is perhaps one of the reasons these technology companies are coming in. I put my money on India's carbon markets. We have one of the emerging carbon markets which are coming up in the world after China and Japan and Korea. So I think that's really, and if we can find some partnership in these three markets, I think that'll be the future, and there's enough in there for us to take this relationship forward.
Thank you so much, Akshay. I know our panelists have a hot stop at 9:30, so we'll wrap this discussion up. Of course, there's so much more that we could discuss and unpack here. We also have an ambassador in India now. We have Ambassador Gore now, who could play a very important role in sort of bridging the trust deficit that we've seen this year, but a lot more to come. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Please stay in touch with the Asia Society Policy Institute. Follow us on our socials, subscribe to our newsletters, and keep watching this space for more. Thank you once again.